Hey guys, welcome back. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I put up this last video showing how I 3D printed these parts really fast, really thin, really light. And I described the fact that I was going to have to reinforce them. So I ended up getting bombarded with questions and comments about reinforcing the fiberglass parts and what to use and so forth, and a lot of like nuanced details. So I'm going to try to cover this as quickly as I can. There's a lot to talk about. I'm going to try to cram this into one video. Made myself a little list, brought in a bunch of examples of stuff to use, and let's get going here. So I think probably the easiest reinforcing material that people can get access to would probably be a polyester resin. You can get this at the hardware store. This is the cheaper stuff. I actually prefer some of the other companies. There's a place here called RevChem that sells like a more industrial grade version. It's only a few dollars, maybe $3 more per gallon, and it's much, much easier to work with. This will work totally fine for your reinforcement. It has a little bit of catalyst here. Read the directions. Depending on where you live, that is going to change. Like, you're going to probably do the instructions, but if you live somewhere hot, like when I was in Florida or here in California during the summers, it gets really hot, you can change the amount of catalyst and control how long it takes for it to actually kick off and harden. So that's probably the one that the easiest go-to. And when you use a polyester resin, you have the option to use a fiberglass mat, like a mat type material, or a fiberglass cloth, which you can buy at the hardware store in little packs, but I usually buy like these big rolls of the stuff, which this isn't cheap, but it'll last you a long time. You make a lot of stuff with it. And with the polyester resin, you can use both. Now, I love working with the fiberglass mat. You can move it around and get it softened up, and then it will really conform to the details. So something like this with all these little piping details, that mat will get in there pretty well if you tap it in with a brush. So you basically saturate the surface, put a little bit down, pop the mat on, and take a brush and you work the fiberglass into all the crevices, and this stuff conforms great. You want to do a couple layers and you should be set. That'll do the trick. That is what I did for 83. This droid that I used on Jedi Temple Challenge, it's 3D printed, and the torso, shorts, and legs are all done with a fiberglass just like this and a fiberglass mat. So let me pull it so you can see the inside here. So you can see it is just fiberglass. It's pretty, smoothed down and so forth. It's really sturdy, very strong part. This is kind of interesting design. I'll go over this droid sometime if everybody wants to see how this thing goes together. I think there's some pretty fun elements to this, but that's for another video. So yeah, fiberglass, and you can see how that mat, it just conforms really easy. It's very easy to work with. But that said, as far as materials go, I don't like using this that much, mainly because of the smell, and it also has a tendency to shrink, and over the long term, fiberglass, this polyester resin, becomes more brittle over time, and a lot of the stuff I'm making isn't going to last. I'm not going to be using it 25 years from now, but in 25 years, it's going to lose a little bit of its pliability and start to crack a little more easily. So on a lot of stuff I do, I prefer to use epoxy, and I use this stuff from Smooth On. It's called EpoxAmite. This thing is filthy. Sorry about that. And it has the hardener. It comes in these bottles. And Smooth On sells these little pumps which pump the appropriate amount. So, one pump of this one and one pump of this one are the correct amount because it's a specific mixture. Now, I like the cure qualities of the epoxy more. It's got a more linear kind of cure state, one that's thinned out versus the polyester resin. Polyester resin wants to kick off and you'll be working and it's fine, all of a sudden it's hard and now you can't move it and you have like hair sticking up or fibers, or if it hits that state, it's not so good. The higher end polyester resins are a little better as far as that goes. Like if you get one that's made for boats, it's a little bit thinner consistency, so it spreads easier. This stuff is kind of like almost honey consistency, but the really professional kind of industrial grade stuff is very, very liquidy water, and it spreads real nice. It's easier to work with. I recommend that if you have access to it. And there's a bunch of brands, but if you look up like boat manufacturing supply places, they'll have a better resin than this. It's the same stuff, smells the same, acts the same. It's just a better quality, and it's only a few bucks more. It's worth the extra dollars. The epoxy is quite a bit more. So a gallon of this is over $100. Goes a long way. Whereas a gallon of this, I think last time I bought one was like 40 something dollars. So it's considerably more. But the epoxy stronger, so you don't need as much of it. So the same amount of material, same amount of space, you can use a third less material for the same strength, and that's really great. One drawback to the epoxy though is that you shouldn't use the fiberglass mat with epoxy. Fiberglass mat and epoxy don't play well together. You can use it, it'll still help a little with the strength, but the way they manufacture this fiberglass mat, let me get this roll here so you can see a little bit better. But to get all these little hairs to stick together and stay on a, as a sheet, they use some kind of starch to hold it all together. Now, the polyester resin will dissolve that starch and really saturate onto the hairs of the fiberglass really, really nicely. Whereas the epoxy does not dissolve the starch. Now, it still will reinforce it a bit, but what happens is if you do break the epoxy part, the little hairs are not properly bonded to the epoxy, so they'll just pull apart, and then you just have a bunch of hairs sticking out, which actually makes it harder to repair the piece too. Whereas the fiberglass, the polyester fiberglass actually bonds to those strands much, much better. You can still have some pull out like that, but it's a much better bond. So if you're going to use epoxy, I would stick to a fiberglass cloth or a cloth-derived product. Like they have fiberglass tape in different dimensions that you can lay out. It's all pre-cut to different diameters. They have a rope you can do. So if you have like details, you can put the rope into the details and saturate it. A lot of stuff to talk about here. So that's where that is. My choice, my preference is epoxy. However, I use the fiberglass a lot. Let me see some stuff that I've got here with epoxy fiberglass. This RA7 head back here is, this one is done with an epoxy fiberglass. I think I showed this in another video maybe. Let's see here. And so you can see it's just like, it's just cloth saturated with epoxy. Same thing, the whole inside is done the same way. And it's very strong. It's only, I think only did 2 layers in here. So it's pretty light. And depending on the cloth you use, it can conform reasonably well if you use the right stuff. I'm going to deal with these later. But yeah, depending on what cloth you get, it can conform pretty well. The stuff I have on the roll here is pretty soft. It conforms reasonably well. However, if we're getting into something like this that has these piping details along the sides, it's going to have trouble getting into those spaces. So you want to be able to reinforce that with something. So when I use the epoxy, I also use an epoxy dough, like Freeform Air, which is a 2-part, literally a dough. You mix it together and you can fill those gaps, and it kind of flattens out the back. So when you lay the fabric down, it doesn't have to contour nearly as much, which means you're going to have less air pockets and so forth. Keeps strength up. The stuff is really, really lightweight. Random tidbit: if you ever saw the prop show on Disney Plus, I can't remember what it is, like this about movie props. There's one that is, I think, covers Nightmare Before Christmas, and these 2 buckets, these exact buckets, are in the foreground of one of those shots at Prop Store. So there's a screen used. But anyway, that's for another time. But Freeform Air is really, really useful for basically flattening those out. And if you get the regular stuff, it takes like, I don't know, 12 hours to cure. So you have plenty of time to probably a good like 20 minutes to work with it, and then put the epoxy down. And by the time the epoxy's cured, everything's really, really bonded properly. And this is epoxy based as well, so they bond very, very nicely together. So there's that aspect. If you want to make a filler out of the polyester resin, going back to polyester, you can add some cabosil. These are like these micro beads. This stuff, I'm not going to open it. This stuff is really bad to breathe, but once it's mixed in, it's fine. But you can use this as a filler and mix it in and thicken up your fiberglass resin, your polyester resin, into a paste, and then you can spread it with a popsicle stick or something and fill in those details. And it kind of works the same as like it works like a body filler kind of, but you can just use some micro balloons. Another option, a lot of options here, are fiberglass strands, which work well too. Pull these open this so you can see it. Boy, that's not been opened in a while. They look like this. It's just chopped fiberglass. This one is a little heavier than what I use this sometimes. The thinner ones I like more. And it's just chopped fiberglass strand, and you can basically just mix it into your fiberglass mix. You just mix up some of this, throw in a handful of the chopped strand, and now it has like reinforcement built into it. And it works really good for filling in these little details. You can just kind of work it into place with a popsicle stick, and then you do your fiberglass over. Same concept. You want to kind of level out the insides of these spaces here. So when you have a divot like this, you want to just get it as level as possible so that your reinforcement doesn't have to contour to the space. So those are the first options. Those are the main ones you're going to use probably for doing costumes. Another thing you could do if you want, it works okay. I don't recommend it for everything, but you can use like casting resin. Like I use Smooth Cast 65D. This works all right for kind of like roto casting. So if I took this part and poured small amounts of that resin in here and basically rolled it around on the surface to coat it, did that a few times to get a surface coat, that would work okay. For something like this where it's on the interior, it'll be fine, but this resin does not bond well with a lot of 3D printed parts. So if it's on the inside and it's a support, it's shaped like the part, it's going to be fine. But if you try to put it on the outside, it'll end up peeling off. It comes off of the 3D prints really easily, so it doesn't really work very well if you need it to actually bond to the surface. But again, if it's contoured to the shape, you've now recreated the inside, it's not going to come out or get lost. It'll be fine. It'll help support it and so forth. So it can work in certain situations. I actually used it for these guys. So this is a master pattern of a part. Now, I ended up making a bunch of resin versions of these, but this is the master that was 3D printed. And when I did this, I actually bought the CR10S5 to make this part, but I did not get the printer in time. So I had to print this in a bunch of pieces, and they're all hooked together inside. And then I basically used resin like that, and I rotocast the inside to hold everything in place. And it worked great for that. Would I use it on a costume part? Maybe like a helmet or something where I just need to slosh. I just don't want it to be like, I want it to be a little sturdier, but it doesn't necessarily need all the fabric reinforcement. Could work really great. Actually, for 83, another one, the inside of this helmet it's lined with epoxy. I did a similar thing. I did not use any cloth or fabric. I just brushed in a few layers of epoxy to help stiffen it up, just to make sure that it would hold its shape if it got too hot for some reason. And that is basically how that thing is made. So the face and head epoxy brush up on the inside, no reinforcement. Works well. This thing got through 10 episodes of a TV show, held up just fine, so that's good. And then if you want to reinforce for something different, like another example is these guys here, which are vacuform masks. These were made for the show The Masked Dancer, which is an offshoot of The Masked Singer, which I worked on a couple episodes of Masked Singer, a couple seasons of Masked Singer, and I worked on Masked Dancer, and these were for that show. These are vacuum formed out of ABS, just like a stormtrooper costume, like exactly the same material. But the buck I designed in ZBrush. This sat outside for a long time, so it's a little beat up now, but this is a 3D printed buck, and then I filled it with Ultra Cal 30, which is, it's a really heavy duty plaster. Technically, I guess it's a concrete, but it's really, really fine, so it works like plaster. So I backed the whole thing really rock hard and drilled the holes in the fronts to get the vacuum form to, you know, pull down what it should. But you know, the parts came out really good and beautiful. They got used on TV shows, so that's cool. And this is also how I did the gauntlets for all the kids for Jedi Temple Challenge. All those gauntlets, I did those as well. So when you see those little kids run around, they got little Stormtrooper gauntlets on. Those were done the exact same way as this. I have those bulks around here somewhere too, but I'll save vacuum forming for another video. And depending on the part, if you're not going to wear it, but it's a 3D printed part and you just need to reinforce it, there are a couple options too. Like you can use expanding foam, which I have around here somewhere. So here's a good example of one. This part got broken just recently, but so this is a mask that I made for a production I was in, which I just recently popped the piece loose here. You can see where the key was. And this has literally no reinforcement on the inside. It's just a 3D print. But the horns, I made sure there was a pass-through for the whole thing. And then I, from the inside, poured through an expanding foam called Pro Foam that's from, where is it? From Motion Picture Effects. It's the same stuff I used to make these like mascot feet. It's real strong, but it's flexible. And it expands to fill the surface. So I use that for these. So for details like this, it'll work great. This one did pop loose just because it's at a key, so there's barely any, there's literally like that much actual foam holding it together. So I gotta fix that, but you can see how it passes through. This held up really well for me for, you know, the shoot and everything. It was fine. But it's pretty cool. And then another helmet that I was doing, mask, working on it about the same time. This one's still in progress. This goat head, it's not fully haired yet, but these horns are done the exact same way, where I basically drilled holes here, poured the foam in, so the horns are reinforced with foam, and the inside of this is actually reinforced with epoxy. Really sturdy. Nice thing, printed really thin. These two helmets were made almost the exact same way. I can go into that on another video if you're interested. Now, the reason I picked the Pro Foam for those parts is that it has some flexibility to it. So if those parts were to get cracked, the main thing is I just want it to sort of hold together a little bit, which I know that one's popped loose, but again, it's at the key. It's not at a thick point. I want it to be able to, if it got cracked, that stuff has a little give, so the rigid print part might crack, but the foam itself would have a little give to it, which is kind of what I was after. You know, like I said, let me show you this foot again. You know, if it bends, you know, the outside cracks, this part has a little resiliency. You can use a rigid expanding foam like I did with the Boba Fett arms. So inside, this part doesn't have any foam, which is why it broke. This thing filled with rigid foam, and this Boba Fett that I've had for years, probably saw my videos from like 4 or 5 years ago, that thing lived outside in the sun for years and basically held up fine. The reason the arm broke, it got blown over in the wind one day and it fell over and a piece broke off, so I got to fix that. But all reinforced with expanding foam. I wouldn't use it on something this thin because it'll probably deform it, but if this was like 3 layers thick, expanding foam probably work really well. Man, some of the questions that came up or comments that I got were about the exothermic properties of the resin deforming the 3D printed part. This is an issue if you go really thick. If I was to laminate one of these parts with either the fiberglass or the epoxy, those are my two choices that I'll probably be using for these. If you go with thick layer, it could get warm enough to deform the part. However, it probably won't. I've done stuff this thin before and I've never had an issue. Where it gets really hot is if you leave that stuff in a cup and it really kicks off, it can get super hot. Epoxy can start smoking, almost catch on fire, maybe catch on fire. But once it's thinned out, it'll warm up, but it's going to be okay on these parts. I don't think it's going to be so hot that it deforms it. But for the sake of safety, you want to put them in a position where if it's hot enough to deform it, it's in a neutral position where there's nothing pushing on it or it's not laying on its side. Because if it does get hot enough to deform, it's going to deform. So you want to put it in a position where if it's hot enough, it doesn't really have a room to move. But yeah, so anyway, that's like the basics. Trying to think if there's anything else I could go into. There's a lot I could do on instruction on how to do these, but I think it's probably too much for this video. Hopefully that was a little bit informative about some of the different things that I use for reinforcements. Again, my two choices, either polyester resin or epoxy. I lean toward the epoxy. I like it more, but the polyester works great. I've used it on all kinds of stuff before. So let's see, do I have anything else around here? I feel like I hopefully covered the very basics. Yeah, we're gonna go with that. I'm gonna do a one take. I'm not gonna edit this thing. I apologize, but I got way too much to do today, and I'm over 20 minutes right now. So if you have more questions, let me know in the comments, and if there's answers that I can come up with that I didn't address in this video, I will put them in the description. So if you come across this and get to the end and you're questioning things, check the description and see if I've answered any of them. I might end up making another video. I will probably make another video on my print settings for these, just because short video. And I could talk about doing these fiberglass layups forever. There's so much nuance to these things and so many if that then this kind of angles for how to put anything together. So you know, it's a per project basis for a lot of these for me. So anyway, hopefully that's helpful. I'm gonna walk around here and shut off this camera, and I'll keep chatting as I go so you won't be too lonely. All the way around my bench. Bye.